The city breathed quietly under the cover of night, a rhythm of distant sirens, murmuring winds through narrow alleys, and the soft flicker of streetlights that cast long, wavering shadows across cracked sidewalks. In one of those shadows moved a figure who had become something of a legend, though few could claim to have truly known him. He was known simply as Omar el Silencio. A man whose reputation traveled faster than his footsteps, whose presence demanded attention even when he spoke not a single word. It was not just his silence that fascinated people, it was the weight of it, the kind of quiet that made the air itself feel heavy, as though every whisper around him might shatter against some invisible barrier. Omar's life was a paradox, both feared and respected, a ghost of the underworld who could shape events with gestures, glances, and the mere hint of movement. Criminals, politicians, and even law enforcement found themselves unnerved by his quiet mastery. There was a strange poetry in it, a rhythm that others could not replicate. Silence, in his world, was more powerful than the roar of a gunshot, more commanding than shouting or threats. It spoke of discipline, strategy, and, above all, control. People learned quickly that when Omar entered a room, the conversation changed. Eyes shifted, and the undercurrent of tension thickened. Those who underestimated him often did so at their peril, discovering far too late that silence could deliver consequences sharper than any weapon. In order to understand Omar, one must first understand the city that forged him. Streets lined with graffiti, dimly lit corners, the occasional flicker of neon reflecting on rain-soaked pavements, this was the backdrop of his youth. Childhood laughter mingled with the occasional shout of conflict. Life in these neighborhoods was a lesson in resilience, observation, and caution. It was here, amidst both the ordinary and the dangerous, that Omar first learned the language of silence. He watched more than he spoke, listened more than he acted, and when he did act, it was precise, intentional, and unforgettable. From an early age, he developed a sense of timing and awareness that set him apart from his peers. Every glance, every movement became a tool, a weapon even, honed in the quiet, unnoticed moments of his youth. As he grew, the pull of the underworld became irresistible. It was a world structured by rules unspoken but universally understood, a place where loyalty was currency, and silence was both armor and weapon. Omar did not need to boast, argue, or command, his actions, always deliberate, conveyed everything that needed to be said. He learned to observe patterns of behavior, reading intentions and detecting lies as naturally as breathing. In a room filled with noise, he was the calm center, the still point around which the chaos swirled. People spoke of him in hushed tones, crafting rumors, myths, and legends, yet Omar himself said nothing. And perhaps that was his greatest advantage. The unknown always carries power, and with Omar, no one ever truly knew what thoughts lay behind his eyes, what plans he carried beneath the calm exterior. Even as a young man, his reputation for decisive action preceded him. Where others relied on intimidation through threats or loud declarations, Omar relied on subtlety, timing, and a meticulous understanding of human psychology. A single look, a measured pause, the positioning of his body could convey far more than words ever could. And in the underworld, where lives and fortunes hung on decisions made in the shadows, that quiet command could be the difference between survival and disaster. It was this mastery of silence that earned him the name El Silencio, a title that carried respect, fear, and fascination in equal measure. But Omar was not born into infamy. There were steps along the way, early lessons learned in the streets and alleys, moments of observation that would later define his methods. He noticed the mistakes of others, the brashness that led to betrayal, the rash words that triggered unnecessary violence, the overconfidence that left men exposed. In every encounter, he absorbed these lessons silently, internalizing them until action became instinctive, precise, and almost surgical in its execution. This early discipline, coupled with an innate intelligence, allowed him to navigate a world in which noise often led to downfall. By the time he emerged into adulthood, Omar's name was already whispered among those who mattered in the shadows. Yet he remained a paradox, ever present, yet elusive, feared, yet respected, deadly, yet silent. He moved like a shadow, never the center of attention, yet always the axis around which events turned. His silence created tension, and that tension became a form of power in itself. People never knew his next move, never understood the full scope of his intentions, and that uncertainty became his greatest weapon. In this story, we will trace the path of Omar El Silencio, exploring the life of a man who mastered the art of quiet power, who carved a legend out of shadows and subtlety, and whose story continues to intrigue both those who live in the light and those who dwell in the darkness. From his earliest days in a city that molded him, to the silent operations that cemented his place in history, and finally, to the reflections that reveal the human beneath the myth, this journey will uncover a life lived in whispers, shadows, and calculated moves. And so, the city sleeps, unaware that in the stillness of night, a ghost named Omar moves with purpose, teaching us all that silence is not merely the absence of sound, but a force, a strategy, and sometimes, the most compelling story of all. Omar's story begins not in the boardrooms of crime or the shadowed alleys of the city's underworld, but in the quiet corners of a neighborhood where life was measured in small victories and silent struggles. His earliest memories were of narrow streets lined with worn-down buildings, where the walls seemed to absorb every sound, every whisper, every secret. Children played amidst the cracks in the sidewalks, their laughter punctuating the distant hum of traffic and the occasional wail of sirens far off in the night. It was in this environment, seemingly ordinary yet quietly unforgiving, that Omar's character was first shaped, molded by circumstances far beyond his control, and lessons that would later define him. From the beginning, Omar was a boy of observation. While others shouted to be noticed, he learned the subtle art of seeing without being seen, of listening without drawing attention. He noticed patterns that adults around him missed, the rhythm of a neighbor's footsteps, the way arguments unfolded, the signs that preceded both danger and opportunity. This acute awareness became second nature, a skill that would later serve him in the most perilous of situations. Even as a child, he understood that words could betray, that speaking without thinking could invite conflict, and that silence, when wielded carefully, could offer protection and insight. His family life, though not marked by wealth or comfort, was rich in lessons of endurance and resilience. The neighborhood was tough, shaped by generations who had learned to survive amid scarcity and threat. Parents worked long hours, neighbors looked out for one another, and children learned early that trust was precious and easily broken. In this environment, Omar learned the value of careful observation, the importance of reading people, and the subtle power that came from restraint. Small incidents, like a confrontation between older children, or a heated argument in the market, were not just moments of curiosity for him, they were studies in human behavior, lessons in strategy, patience, and consequence. Despite the harshness of his surroundings, Omar experienced moments of childhood innocence. The smell of rain on sun-baked pavement, the soft glow of lamplight reflecting off puddles, the laughter of friends running through alleyways, these were the quiet, fleeting images of his early world. Yet even within these moments of normalcy, the undercurrent of danger was never far away. He learned to move with caution, to assess his environment, and to recognize that even ordinary life was interwoven with the potential for threat. This awareness did not make him fearful, it made him disciplined, attuned to detail, and quietly resilient. School offered him another arena in which to refine his abilities. While classmates sought attention through words and actions, Omar remained observant, often listening rather than speaking, noting interactions and patterns with a precision beyond his years. Teachers occasionally misinterpreted his silence for shyness, yet behind those calm eyes, he was absorbing every detail, the subtle hierarchies among children, the gestures that hinted at anger or deceit, the ways in which influence and fear could shape behavior. He began to understand the unspoken rules of social dynamics, the way power could shift quietly, and how the observant could gain an advantage without confrontation. Yet the streets outside the schoolyard were a classroom of their own, far harsher and more unforgiving. Here, survival was less about textbooks and more about instincts, timing, and courage. Omar watched as peers navigated challenges, sometimes falling victim to brash decisions or careless words. He learned from their mistakes, storing every lesson silently, understanding that strength was not always measured in action but often in restraint. A quick glance, a silent approach, a well-timed retreat, these early experiences honed a mindset that would later define him: control through observation, precision through patience, and power without unnecessary noise. Family struggles further shaped Omar's early life. Financial hardships and the daily pressures of survival instilled a quiet determination within him. He saw how words, when wielded carelessly, could create tension or escalate conflict, and he understood that silence often carried more weight than argument. Moments of familial tension were absorbed and studied, and Omar began to internalize the principle that discretion and patience could be stronger than immediate action. He learned that listening carefully, understanding fully, and responding with precision was a form of power few recognized, yet one that could command respect without a single word. The neighborhood itself became a tapestry of influence, fear, and subtle lessons. Older children, streetwise and cunning, demonstrated the consequences of pride and impulsiveness. Adults navigated their lives with a quiet vigilance that did not go unnoticed. Omar observed, memorized, and integrated these patterns into his own understanding of the world. Each narrow escape, each subtle negotiation, each moment of careful diplomacy contributed to a foundation of instincts that would later define him as a master of silent enforcement. Even in play, Omar's strategic mind was evident. Games of chance, minor conflicts among friends, and small competitions were opportunities to experiment with observation, anticipation, and timing. He was patient, watching, calculating, and acting at the precise moment that would yield the greatest effect. This approach, learned in the innocent guise of childhood games, mirrored the tactics he would later employ in the dangerous world of organized crime. It was not aggression that marked him but the quiet, precise understanding of cause and effect, of human behavior, and of timing. By the time he entered his teenage years, the boy who moved quietly through the streets had already begun to develop a reputation of sorts, not for violence, not yet, but for presence. People sensed that Omar was different. He did not speak to assert dominance, he observed to understand it. And in a neighborhood where noise and bravado often invited trouble, his calm, measured demeanor set him apart. He learned that power did not always announce itself; sometimes, it was the quietest, most deliberate presence that commanded the greatest attention. It was in these early years, amidst the interplay of innocence, hardship, and subtle observation, that Omar began his transformation into El Silencio. The foundations of his future were quietly laid in the streets, the classrooms, and the homes of his childhood. He learned that silence was a tool, patience was a weapon, and observation was power. Every alley, every whispered argument, every fleeting glance contributed to a growing understanding of the world and the human nature within it. By mastering the lessons of his environment, Omar became a boy who needed no words to understand, no declarations to influence, and no loud gestures to command respect, a silent force quietly shaping the path he would one day walk through shadows and legend. Adolescence arrived for Omar like a subtle shift in the rhythm of his world, a gradual tightening of the streets around him and the emergence of challenges that required more than quiet observation. The innocence of childhood had faded, replaced by a heightened awareness of danger and opportunity alike. He moved through this transitional period with the same patience and precision that had defined his early years, though now the stakes were higher, the lessons harsher, and the consequences far more permanent. The streets whispered secrets, and Omar had learned to listen. Every corner, every alleyway, every passing adult carried information, some spoken, much left unspoken. It was here, in this delicate dance of survival, that he began to understand the unspoken codes that governed not just the playgrounds, but the darker corners of life. School remained a structured refuge, yet the hallways no longer seemed a sanctuary. The social hierarchies that had once appeared distant became immediate and complex. Teenagers tested boundaries, forming alliances, rivalries, and subtle power dynamics. Omar watched quietly as tempers flared, as pride collided with ambition, and as mistakes led to conflict. While many of his peers responded with words, sometimes sharp and reckless, Omar responded with observation, learning to anticipate actions, to understand motivations, and to act only when necessary. Even small disagreements became lessons in strategy, patience, and restraint. He realized that strength did not require volume; sometimes, it required stillness, timing, and an acute awareness of human behavior. The streets, however, offered a far more unforgiving curriculum. Adolescence drew Omar closer to the edge of the underworld, to the fringes of criminal activity that shaped his environment. He saw older youths engaging in petty thefts, shakedowns, and secret dealings, and he recognized the silent rules they followed. There were no teachers here, no lectures, only consequence and survival. Omar observed the outcomes of actions, noting the impulsive moves that led to pain or arrest, and the calculated risks that produced respect or advantage. He began to understand the value of timing, the significance of reputation, and the subtle influence of intimidation, all without ever needing to assert himself with words. Even at this stage, his silence was noticeable. While others clamored to make themselves known, to boast, to threaten, Omar's quiet presence had a weight of its own. It was a calm that unsettled those around him, a stillness that suggested he was always calculating, always 3 steps ahead. Rivals and allies alike learned to respect him not because of what he said, but because of what he observed, what he anticipated, and the way his silent scrutiny made them second-guess their own decisions. The very act of remaining quiet became a kind of strategy, a method of influence that required no speech yet carried undeniable authority. Family life continued to provide both grounding and lessons. Omar's household was not immune to struggle. Conversations carried tension, arguments flared and dissipated, and responsibility pressed upon him with increasing weight. He learned to navigate these dynamics with discretion, understanding which battles to fight, which moments to observe, and when silence could preserve safety and stability. These domestic experiences, though less dramatic than the streets, honed his instincts in subtle but essential ways, teaching him that power could often lie in restraint, and that patience often bore greater fruit than immediate action. Omar also encountered mentors during this period, figures from the neighborhood who operated in the gray spaces between legality and crime. They noticed his quiet intelligence, his ability to read situations without interference, and his capacity for restraint. In a world where bluster often dominated, his calm, observant demeanor was unusual, and those with experience began to see potential. They introduced him to early lessons in loyalty, enforcement, and negotiation, not through lectures, but through example. Omar absorbed these lessons like a sponge, internalizing the principles of observation, strategic thinking, and silent influence. Every encounter, every whispered warning, every silent gesture became part of the toolkit that would one day define him as El Silencio. It was during adolescence that Omar began to test boundaries, carefully, deliberately. He would step into minor conflicts to assert authority or demonstrate skill, but always with control. Each action was measured, precise, and carefully calculated. He avoided unnecessary noise, opting instead for outcomes that carried weight and consequence without attracting unwanted attention. This approach distinguished him from peers, setting him apart in a world where recklessness often invited trouble. He understood that in the shadows, reputation was built not on volume, but on precision, reliability, and the quiet certainty of action. Omar's interactions with peers increasingly reflected his emerging persona. Where others argued, he negotiated silently, using gestures, glances, and presence to influence outcomes. Minor confrontations became lessons in human psychology, teaching him how to assess threats, identify weakness, and leverage subtle intimidation. Even casual acquaintances learned to sense his capability, understanding intuitively that beneath the calm exterior lay someone capable of decisive, and often irreversible, action. Each interaction strengthened his confidence, sharpened his instincts, and further entrenched the principle that silence could carry far more weight than speech. The city itself continued to shape him, a constant teacher of risk, reward, and consequence. Alleyways that smelled of damp brick, flickering streetlights that cast long, uncertain shadows, and the distant echo of footsteps at night all contributed to an environment that demanded vigilance. Omar moved through this world with care, observing, calculating, and internalizing every nuance. Every misstep he witnessed, every mistake he avoided, and every silent victory he achieved became part of a growing mosaic of experience, a foundation for the man he was quietly becoming. By the end of his teenage years, Omar was no longer just a boy learning the lessons of his neighborhood, he was a young man quietly mastering the arts of observation, strategy, and silent influence. He had developed the instincts, patience, and awareness that would later define his career as an enforcer who needed no words to command respect. His adolescence was not marked by bravado or noise, but by careful attention, quiet calculation, and the steady accumulation of skills that would carry him into the dangerous world of organized crime. In this period, the seeds of Omar el Silencio were firmly planted. The lessons of the streets, the guidance of mentors, the discipline honed through observation, and the quiet understanding of human behavior all combined to shape a figure who would one day move through shadows with authority and precision. Adolescence had forged his mind, sharpened his instincts, and prepared him for a world in which silence could be both a weapon and a shield, a world where the quietest presence could command the loudest respect. Adulthood arrived for Omar with the quiet inevitability of a shadow stretching across a dimly lit street. The lessons of childhood and adolescence had been absorbed, refined, and practiced, and now the streets began to offer him opportunities that would shape the trajectory of his life. It was a world governed by rules unspoken, yet universally understood, a delicate balance of loyalty, respect, and fear. This was the realm of organized crime, a landscape that demanded precision, discretion, and unwavering control. For Omar, it was less a choice and more a calling, an environment where his skills, observation, patience, and silent influence, could flourish without unnecessary exposure. His first steps into this world were subtle, almost imperceptible. He did not announce his presence with bravado, nor did he boast of intentions or capabilities. Instead, he moved quietly, learning the hierarchy, noting alliances, and observing the dynamics of power that dictated who rose and who fell. The older men in these circles were formidable, their reputations earned through decades of careful maneuvering, violence, and calculated risk. Omar watched them, learned from their decisions, and recognized patterns that others failed to see. Even in a room filled with threats and whispered warnings, he remained calm, his silence both a shield and a statement. The initiation into organized crime was not dramatic in the way movies often depict, it was a measured process, a series of tests designed to assess loyalty, courage, and intelligence. Omar faced these tests with quiet confidence. He did not seek to impress with words or gestures, he demonstrated his worth through action, precision, and reliability. Tasks were assigned, some menial, some risky, and each became an opportunity for him to prove that he could be trusted, that he could carry out duties without complaint, and that his presence, though silent, commanded respect. These early missions were the foundation upon which his reputation would be built, each success reinforcing the lesson that in the shadows, actions mattered far more than words. One of the first challenges he encountered involved mediating a dispute between two factions within the organization. Tempers flared, voices rose, and threats were exchanged, yet Omar approached the situation with calm observation. He studied the body language, the tone of voice, the subtle signs of insecurity and hidden agendas. When he finally intervened, it was not with shouting or intimidation, but with a simple, decisive action that resolved the conflict without unnecessary escalation. This quiet authority earned him the attention of senior figures, who began to recognize that Omar's strength lay not in his voice, but in his ability to influence outcomes through understanding, timing, and precision. As he took on more responsibilities, Omar became increasingly aware of the delicate balance of loyalty and power that defined the underworld. Betrayal could appear in the form of whispered rumors, opportunistic alliances, or subtle acts of deception. Survival depended not just on strength, but on perception and foresight. Omar's silence became his greatest asset. It allowed him to observe without revealing intentions, to assess without provoking suspicion, and to act decisively when necessary. Others underestimated him, assuming that quietness equated to weakness, yet time and again, he demonstrated that restraint could be far more formidable than aggression. His first real encounters with violence were controlled, deliberate, and precise. Omar learned that fear could be instilled without bloodshed, that intimidation could be achieved through presence, timing, and a reputation carefully cultivated. A nod, a glance, or the mere act of appearing at the right place at the right time could accomplish what words or weapons often could not. These experiences cemented his understanding that the most effective enforcers were not those who made noise, but those who commanded attention through silent mastery of their environment. Mentorship played a subtle but critical role in these formative years. Older figures within the organization recognized Omar's potential and began to guide him, sharing wisdom in understated ways. They taught him the importance of patience, the necessity of strategy, and the value of discretion. Lessons were rarely direct, they came through observation, shared experiences, and sometimes through situations designed to test resolve and judgment. Omar absorbed these lessons with the keen attention of a man who understood that every detail could mean the difference between survival and downfall. During this period, Omar also began to develop a network of allies, individuals who respected his discretion, relied on his judgment, and recognized the power of his silence. Unlike many who sought to impress with boasts or threats, Omar's influence grew quietly, steadily, and imperceptibly. His reputation became something of a legend among those who operated in the shadows. People spoke of him in hushed tones, aware that his calm demeanor masked a capability far beyond ordinary men. His presence alone could shift the balance in tense situations, and even rivals began to recognize the subtle danger inherent in underestimating him. The work was not without risk. Missteps, miscalculations, or misjudgments could have immediate and severe consequences. Omar learned to navigate these dangers with a careful blend of observation, patience, and decisive action. Each challenge strengthened his instincts, honed his ability to read people, and reinforced the principle that silence, when wielded with intelligence, could command power greater than any display of force. He became increasingly confident in his methods, understanding that every successful operation, every quietly resolved conflict, and every act of restraint contributed to the reputation that would eventually define him as El Silencio. Omar's early accomplishments did not go unnoticed. The organization began to rely on him for sensitive tasks, those requiring discretion, timing, and a subtle application of authority. He became the go-to enforcer when discretion was paramount, a figure whose silent presence could shape outcomes without the need for words. This growing responsibility also carried increased scrutiny. Rivals, curious or suspicious, watched him, testing his reactions, attempting to provoke missteps. Yet Omar maintained his composure, responding only when necessary, and always with precision. His silence remained both a mystery and a weapon, amplifying the tension that followed him wherever he went. By the end of this initiation period, Omar had transformed from a quiet observer into a capable and respected enforcer within the organization. He had earned his place through action, strategy, and unwavering discipline. His reputation for silence and precision became firmly established, setting the stage for future operations that would further enhance his legend. What others took years to learn, control, discretion, patience, Omar had mastered quietly, methodically, and with remarkable efficiency. The world he entered was one of shadows, where visibility often meant vulnerability, and where words could betray faster than any adversary could strike. In this environment, Omar's silent approach became his signature. He had proven that influence did not require speech, that power could be asserted without noise, and that reputation, carefully cultivated, could command respect even in the most dangerous circles. The lessons of his early adulthood, observation, patience, discretion, and silent mastery, were the foundation upon which the legend of El Silencio would be built. As night fell over the city, Omar walked its streets with the quiet confidence of a man who understood the rules, the risks, and the rewards of his chosen path. Every step, every glance, and every action was measured, deliberate, and significant. He had entered the world of organized crime not with fanfare or spectacle, but with the calm assurance of one who knew that silence, above all, could speak louder than any gunshot, any shout, or any threat. In the shadows, Omar had found his purpose, and in silence, he had found his power, a power that would soon echo through every corner of the underworld. It was during these early years of involvement that Omar truly earned the name that would follow him through the streets, alleys, and whispers of the underworld, El Silencio. Unlike nicknames that are shouted in fear or claimed with bravado, his was whispered in awe, carried carefully from one corner of the city to another. It was a name born not of legend alone, but of repeated observation, of actions measured and precise, of a presence so quiet that it unsettled even the most seasoned criminals. Those who encountered him often found themselves thinking more about the weight of his silence than the danger of his fists, the mere fact of his calm attention more intimidating than any verbal threat could be. The origin of the name was subtle, almost poetic. There was no dramatic event that catapulted him into infamy, rather, it was a series of quiet actions, moments where his silence spoke volumes. In a tense standoff between rival factions, Omar's refusal to speak, his deliberate, measured movements, and his calm, unwavering gaze had diffused what could have erupted into chaos. Men accustomed to bluster and threats found themselves frozen in uncertainty, unsure how to read his intentions. It was in these moments that they began to murmur among themselves, "That one, he doesn't need words. He is El Silencio." The name stuck, a quiet acknowledgement of a power that required no proclamation. Omar's silent reputation was reinforced by countless other incidents, each small in isolation but monumental in accumulation. During enforcement tasks, he displayed a methodical efficiency that left no doubt in anyone's mind about his capability. A simple presence could deter conflict, a measured gesture could command compliance, and his unwavering calm in high-stakes situations became a hallmark of his identity. People learned to fear not just the possibility of violence, but the certainty of his attention. It was as if his silence carried an invisible weight, pressing against the room, shaping the behavior of those around him without a single sound. The psychological impact of his silence was profound. In a world accustomed to noise, boasting, and intimidation, Omar's quietude was disarming. Allies felt reassurance under his observation, knowing he would act decisively when necessary, yet they also sensed the tension that accompanied his stillness, a subtle reminder that consequences followed him like a shadow. Rivals, conversely, were unsettled, unsure when or how he might strike, uncertain of the depth of his planning or the reach of his influence. This uncertainty became a tool, a weapon as powerful as any physical force. It allowed Omar to navigate dangerous situations with a confidence that few could challenge, and it cemented his place as someone who operated beyond conventional expectations. Omar's silence extended beyond mere words, it permeated his actions, his decisions, and the way he moved through the world. When he entered a room, people sensed it immediately. Conversations would falter, glances would shift, and even seasoned enforcers would pause to reassess their positions. He never raised his voice, yet his presence alone commanded attention. It was a kind of mastery that few understood, a discipline honed over years of careful observation, strategic patience, and meticulous attention to detail. Each act, no matter how small, reinforced the aura of precision and quiet power that defined him. Part of what made Omar's silence so effective was his consistency. He never acted impulsively, never reacted without thought, and never allowed emotion to dictate behavior. Every decision was deliberate, every move calculated, every gesture purposeful. This consistency created a reliability that his allies depended on and a predictability that his enemies feared in the worst possible way, because it was the predictability of excellence, not incompetence. People learned that when Omar chose to act, the outcome would be decisive, leaving little room for negotiation or error. And yet, until that moment, he remained inscrutable, unreadable, silent. His rise as El Silencio also relied heavily on observation. Omar did not rely on intimidation through threats alone, he studied patterns, anticipated behaviors, and recognized vulnerabilities. In a tense negotiation or a volatile standoff, he could predict the reactions of others before a single word was exchanged. His ability to read intentions and manipulate outcomes through presence rather than noise was uncanny. He understood that control was not simply a matter of physical strength, but a subtle interplay of perception, timing, and psychological influence. Every act reinforced the legend, every silent decision contributed to the myth, and every carefully measured gesture left an impression that words could never achieve. Even outside of operational duties, Omar's silence commanded respect. In social interactions, he spoke only when necessary, his words concise and purposeful. People learned quickly that what he said mattered far more than what he left unsaid. There was a certain rhythm to his quietude, a cadence that suggested thoughtfulness, awareness, and unwavering attention. To his associates, this made him a figure of stability and reliability. To his adversaries, it suggested omnipresence and inevitability. The moniker, El Silencio, encapsulated not just his methods, but the aura he carried, a calm, quiet authority that needed no demonstration to be understood. Stories of his silent enforcement began to spread, often exaggerated in retelling but rooted in reality. A simple confrontation avoided disaster because he chose the right moment to act. A threat never voiced prevented violence because his presence communicated intention more clearly than words could. Each tale reinforced the idea that Omar's silence was not weakness but power, an assertion of control that could dominate a room without raising a voice, an enforcement of authority that relied on precision, timing, and observation rather than spectacle. By the time his reputation was firmly established, Omar had become a figure of intrigue and caution. His nickname was more than a label, it was a recognition of skill, intelligence, and discipline. It was a reminder that in a world ruled by noise and aggression, some of the most formidable forces operate quietly, unseen until the moment of action. The man who needed no words had crafted an identity that commanded attention, instilled fear, and demanded respect, all through the deliberate mastery of silence. And so, Omar El Silencio moved through the underworld with a calm confidence that few could challenge. The lessons of his youth, the discipline of his adolescence, and the precision of his early adulthood coalesced into a persona that was both enigmatic and unavoidable. Silence, he had discovered, was not absence. It was presence, power, and influence, a force that carried its own weight, shaped its own reality, and left an impression deeper than any shouted threat ever could. It was in this way that Omar became more than a man, he became a symbol of controlled authority, a shadow whose quiet movements resonated louder than any sound, and a legend that would endure in whispers long after the echoes of his deeds had faded. Omar's first missions as an enforcer marked a quiet turning point in his life, a moment when observation, patience, and silent authority began to be tested in ways that carried real consequence. Unlike the dramatized tales of sudden violence often told in stories, these early assignments were deliberate exercises in strategy, restraint, and precise action. Each task was an opportunity to prove not only his capability, but the effectiveness of his signature approach, a calm presence, unspoken power, and actions that spoke louder than any words. It was in these early experiences that Omar began to refine his unique methods, shaping the reputation that would come to define him across the underworld. The assignments themselves varied, each presenting a different challenge that demanded subtlety and foresight. Sometimes it involved ensuring compliance with an organization's rules, a simple yet tense task of reminding individuals of boundaries and consequences without igniting unnecessary conflict. At other times, it required the quiet intimidation of rival figures, the demonstration of authority in situations where noise could escalate danger. Through each task, Omar's signature approach became clear: he observed first, analyzed the situation, and intervened only when necessary. His movements were deliberate, his gestures controlled, and every interaction carried a weight that others quickly recognized, even if they could not articulate why. One early mission involved a dispute over a shipment that had gone missing, a situation that had the potential to ignite violence between factions. The tension in the room was palpable, voices rose, eyes darted, and every gesture seemed loaded with threat. Omar, entering silently, assessed the dynamics with careful attention. He observed the subtle cues, a tightened jaw, a shifting stance, the unspoken fear hidden behind bravado. Instead of asserting himself through words, he chose a measured approach, positioning himself strategically, allowing his calm presence to dominate the space. The result was remarkable. The conflict diffused without a single shouted threat, the parties reassured that the situation was under control, and Omar quietly reinforced his growing reputation for precision and authority. In another instance, Omar was tasked with ensuring that a local business paid its dues to the organization, a situation fraught with potential resistance. Instead of relying on bluster or aggression, he approached with calculated subtlety. His silence carried weight. The owners knew from reputation alone that defiance would carry consequences beyond their imagination. He did not need to raise his voice, his calm, unwavering attention communicated everything. The payment was made, the matter resolved, and the lesson was reinforced. Authority did not need volume, presence alone could command obedience. These small yet significant successes were crucial in building both his confidence and the respect of others within the organization. Omar's effectiveness was not merely in compliance enforcement, but also in the psychological impact of his methods. People in his presence experienced a tension that was simultaneously unsettling and impossible to ignore. Allies learned that he could be relied upon to act decisively when necessary, while rivals feared the quiet certainty of his presence. The aura of anticipation created by his silence became a tool in itself, amplifying the influence of his actions and ensuring that every movement carried greater significance. In essence, Omar turned quiet observation into a form of power, one that few could challenge without risking immediate consequence. It was during these early missions that Omar began to understand the intricate balance between risk and control. Every operation carried potential danger. Miscalculation could result in injury, betrayal, or exposure. Yet his calm demeanor allowed him to maintain focus, to weigh the variables, and to act with precision. The ability to remain composed under pressure, to anticipate reactions, and to assert influence without unnecessary confrontation became his hallmark. Each successful task reinforced the principle that silence, when coupled with skill and understanding, could achieve results far beyond what words or threats ever could. Mentorship continued to play a subtle role during these early assignments. Senior figures in the organization observed Omar closely, offering guidance not through lectures but through example and subtle instruction. They showed him how to read situations, how to measure the impact of presence, and how to act decisively while maintaining the calm that was so central to his effectiveness. Omar absorbed these lessons with remarkable attention, integrating them into his own methods and refining his unique style of enforcement. Each mission became a laboratory in which he tested, adjusted, and perfected his approach to authority and influence. During this period, Omar also began to build a network of trust among his peers. The reliability of his actions, the precision of his interventions, and the integrity of his silence earned him allies who understood the value of discretion and control. These relationships were cultivated quietly, based on demonstrated competence rather than conversation or persuasion. Omar's reputation spread not through boastful announcements, but through consistent performance, the kind that left people quietly impressed, cautious, and deeply respectful. In the shadows of the city, he became a figure whose name evoked attention without explanation, whose presence alone shaped outcomes. Despite the calm and control he exhibited, these early missions were not without emotional and psychological weight. Omar understood that every action carried potential consequences, not only for himself but for the organization and those involved. He approached each task with careful consideration, weighing risk and reward, anticipating reactions, and preparing for contingencies. This mindset reinforced the discipline that defined him and ensured that his growing reputation was not built on recklessness, but on measured effectiveness, strategic foresight, and an unwavering command of his environment. These formative experiences laid the groundwork for Omar's future as a master enforcer. They demonstrated that influence could be achieved quietly, that authority could be asserted without words, and that precision and calm could outweigh aggression and noise. His first missions were not just tests of skill, they were the crucible in which the principles of Silencio were forged: patience, observation, psychological mastery, and silent yet undeniable power. By the conclusion of these early assignments, Omar had begun to establish himself as someone different, someone whose presence mattered even when no words were spoken. His methods were subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye, yet undeniably effective. People began to recognize that Omar's silence was not weakness, it was a calculated strategy, an extension of his intelligence and discipline. In the world of shadows and whispered threats, he had already begun to command respect, to instill caution, and to leave an impression that would only grow with time. As night fell over the city, Omar walked the streets with the same quiet confidence that had guided him through his first missions. Each step, each glance, each unspoken decision reinforced the truth he had come to embody: silence was not absence, nor was it passivity. Silence was action, influence, and authority, a force more enduring and precise than noise or aggression. And in this way, the early missions of Omar el Silencio became the foundation of a legend, a reputation built on quiet mastery and unwavering precision, echoing through the shadows long after the streets themselves had gone silent. As Omar's reputation grew, he found himself navigating the intricate web of the mafia hierarchy, a structure both rigid and delicate, where power, loyalty, and reputation were constantly tested. The organization was a world unto itself, governed by rules unspoken but universally understood, a place where a single misstep could have consequences far beyond what words could describe. In this environment, Omar's silence became not only a tool, but a shield. He learned to move among powerful figures, discerning alliances, understanding rivalries, and observing the subtle dynamics that dictated who thrived and who fell. The hierarchy was complex, layered with authority figures who demanded respect, younger enforcers eager to prove themselves, and a constant undercurrent of competition. Omar approached this landscape with the same patience and observation that had defined his youth and early adulthood. He did not seek attention, he allowed the world to reveal itself through interactions, subtle cues, and the unspoken behaviors of those around him. His calm presence acted as a stabilizing force, yet it also carried an invisible tension, an awareness that he understood far more than he revealed. Alliances within the organization were fragile and constantly shifting. Friends could become rivals, loyalty could be tested by opportunity, and power could shift with the quietest of gestures. Omar learned to recognize these patterns early, understanding that the true strength of influence lay in observation and timing. He did not rush to act, but waited, letting situations unfold until he could step in with maximum impact. His silence allowed him to perceive threats, assess intentions, and plan interventions with a clarity that few possessed. It was this ability to read people and circumstances that gradually earned him both respect and caution from peers and superiors alike. One of the most critical lessons Omar learned was that the mafia hierarchy operated on dual principles: authority and perception. Authority commanded obedience, but perception determined reputation. A man could hold a high rank, yet if he lacked respect, influence, or fear, his position was tenuous. Omar observed carefully as others sought to assert dominance through noise, intimidation, or reckless displays of force. He noted the mistakes they made, the brash words, the ill-timed threats, the overestimation of strength, and internalized them as lessons for his own approach. He realized that true power was quieter, more deliberate, and rooted in consistency, precision, and the ability to control both action and perception. Omar also began to cultivate a network of allies, carefully chosen for their reliability, intelligence, and discretion. These were individuals who understood the value of patience and strategy, who appreciated the power of subtle influence, and who respected Omar's approach to enforcement and negotiation. Unlike many in the underworld, he did not rely on coercion or fear alone, he fostered loyalty through trust, competence, and the quiet demonstration of capability. This network became an extension of his influence, a support system that allowed him to operate effectively within the complex dynamics of the organization. Navigating rivalries was equally critical. Competitors, both within the organization and outside it, constantly tested boundaries, sought to challenge authority, and probed for weaknesses. Omar's silence became a defensive and offensive tool simultaneously. By not revealing his intentions, he created uncertainty and hesitation in others. Rivals could never be certain of his next move, and this ambiguity often deterred confrontations before they began. When action was necessary, it was swift, precise, and decisive, leaving no room for doubt. This approach reinforced the reputation of El Silencio, and ensured that he remained a figure both respected and cautiously feared. The rules of the underworld, while never written in manuals, were deeply ingrained in the culture of the organization. Respect for hierarchy, discretion in dealings, loyalty to allies, and strategic use of force were principles Omar quickly mastered. He observed those who violated these unspoken codes and saw the consequences unfold, understanding that survival depended on adherence to both the letter and spirit of these rules. Yet he also recognized the opportunities within these constraints, identifying moments when a carefully calculated action could elevate his influence without attracting unnecessary attention. His adherence to the rules, combined with his strategic interventions, allowed him to gain both trust and authority over time. As Omar's understanding of the hierarchy deepened, he became increasingly adept at mediating disputes. Conflict was constant in the underworld, arising from financial disagreements, personal slights, or challenges to authority. Omar's approach was unique. He did not rely on volume or aggression to assert dominance. Instead, he applied careful observation, psychological insight, and precise timing to guide outcomes. He would listen, watch, and wait, allowing tensions to reveal their sources before stepping in. His interventions were quiet but effective, often resolving disputes without violence or escalating tension. This skill further solidified his reputation as a figure whose presence mattered, whose judgment was trusted, and whose silence carried weight beyond measure. Another critical aspect of navigating the hierarchy was understanding the motivations of those around him. Omar learned to read not only actions but intentions, detecting subtle signs of ambition, fear, or deceit. This ability allowed him to anticipate challenges, preempt threats, and position himself advantageously. His silence, far from being a limitation, enhanced his perceptive capabilities. Without speaking, he gathered information, interpreted behaviors, and acted with insight that left others unaware of the full scope of his understanding. In this way, he became not just an enforcer but a strategist, capable of influencing outcomes across multiple layers of the organization. Omar's growing influence also attracted attention from higher-ranking members of the hierarchy. Senior figures began to recognize his capability for both enforcement and negotiation, his precision in action, and his uncanny ability to maintain control without unnecessary exposure. His reliability and judgment made him a valuable asset, and he was increasingly entrusted with critical assignments, tasks that required discretion, strategic insight, and a calm presence. These responsibilities were a testament to his skill, and each successful completion reinforced his position within the organization. Through it all, Omar maintained the principles that had guided him from youth: observation, patience, discipline, and silent authority. He did not allow ambition to cloud judgment, nor did he seek recognition through noise or display. His reputation grew not through words, but through consistent action, strategic foresight, and an unshakable calm that distinguished him in a world defined by volatility and danger. The quiet mastery of the hierarchy, the careful cultivation of allies, and the precise handling of rivals all contributed to the legend of El Silencio. By the end of this period, Omar had become more than an enforcer. He had become a figure whose presence alone shaped outcomes, whose silence commanded attention, and whose understanding of the mafia hierarchy allowed him to operate with a level of influence rare even among the most seasoned figures. He had learned the delicate balance of power, the importance of perception, and the value of patience. And in this mastery, he found not only authority, but the foundation for a legend that would echo through the shadows of the underworld for years to come. Omar's rise within the underworld was not sudden, nor was it accompanied by fanfare or dramatics. It was a slow, deliberate ascent, built on countless small actions, precise interventions, and the quiet accumulation of respect and fear. Each mission, each decision, each measured presence added weight to his reputation, establishing him as a figure whose silence spoke volumes. The streets, alleys, and backrooms of the city whispered his name, El Silencio, a moniker that signified more than efficiency or capability. it conveyed an almost mystical authority, a presence that demanded attention without a word. Early on, Omar learned that influence in the criminal world was a delicate balance between action and perception. It was not enough to execute orders, one had to project the right image, maintain credibility, and anticipate the moves of allies and adversaries alike. He began to refine his approach, ensuring that each task he undertook reflected precision, discipline, and control. Whether enforcing rules, resolving disputes, or monitoring rival activities, he acted in ways that reinforced both his competence and his aura of quiet power. People began to associate his name with inevitability, the understanding that when Omar was involved, outcomes would follow his measured design, regardless of noise or bravado surrounding him. One of Omar's first high-profile operations involved securing compliance from a group attempting to bypass the organization's control over local businesses. This was a delicate situation, force could provoke resistance, but indecision could undermine authority. Omar approached the task with his trademark calm. He observed the individuals involved, noted their habits, and understood their motivations before stepping into the scenario. When he acted, it was subtle but effective. A gesture here, a silent positioning there, and the dispute dissolved without confrontation. The business complied, respect for the organization was reinforced, and Omar's presence became a quiet but undeniable influence over those who had once considered defiance. Beyond enforcement, Omar began to cultivate a network of strategic relationships. Allies, mentors, and influential figures within the organization became part of his extended web, each relationship carefully nurtured with reliability, discretion, and mutual understanding. These alliances allowed him to operate with broader influence, gaining insight into operations, anticipating challenges, and positioning himself advantageously within the hierarchy. Trust, in Omar's world, was earned through consistent action, demonstrated capability, and an unspoken understanding of discretion. Words were unnecessary, results were everything. As his responsibilities increased, so too did the stakes. Omar was increasingly tasked with sensitive operations, surveillance, negotiation, and occasional intimidation, where any misstep could have immediate and severe consequences. Yet his training, patience, and silent mastery allowed him to execute these missions with precision. Each successful operation further reinforced the mythos surrounding him, establishing him as not only a capable enforcer but a strategist who could influence outcomes beyond the immediate sphere of his actions. His reputation began to attract attention from figures who had previously doubted his abilities, transforming skepticism into respect and, in some cases, cautious fear. Omar's rise was also marked by an acute understanding of timing and discretion. In one particularly delicate situation, he was assigned to oversee the resolution of a conflict between two powerful allies within the organization. The potential for escalation was high, misjudgment could lead to violence, fractured loyalties, or exposure. Omar observed silently, gauging the emotional currents, understanding subtle power plays, and waiting for the precise moment to act. When he did intervene, it was with such measured subtlety that the dispute resolved peacefully, the reputations of all parties intact, and his own authority further solidified. This operation became emblematic of his approach, quiet, deliberate, and profoundly effective. Part of what elevated Omar's influence was the psychological impact of his presence. In a world accustomed to bluster, threats, and spectacle, his calm and silent approach was unsettling. Rivals never knew what he was thinking, allies never doubted his commitment, and even casual observers sensed the weight of his attention. Silence, in his hands, became more than absence of speech, it became strategy, control, and authority. The uncertainty it created acted as a form of leverage, shaping behavior and outcomes in ways that words or violence alone could not. Omar's meticulous nature extended to his personal interactions as well. He was deliberate in choosing confidants, careful in sharing information, and precise in his communications. Every meeting, every conversation, every gesture was executed with intention. This approach ensured that trust was maintained, alliances remained strong, and his influence continued to grow. Others, even those accustomed to chaos and confrontation, recognized that Omar operated differently. He did not need to assert dominance through loud declarations. His quiet mastery of circumstances, combined with a clear understanding of human behavior, sufficed. With each operation and interaction, Omar's reputation became self-reinforcing. Stories of his calm, effective interventions traveled quietly through the underworld. People spoke of him in hushed tones, both out of respect and caution. Tales circulated of situations resolved without a single word. Of authority asserted without violence, and of outcomes shaped purely by his presence. The name El Silencio became synonymous with inevitability, the understanding that when he was involved, the game was already won, even before he acted. This rising influence also brought new challenges. As Omar's presence became more significant, so too did the scrutiny from rivals and higher-ranking figures. He was tested repeatedly, confronted with situations designed to measure his judgment, patience, and loyalty. Yet each test only reinforced his methods. His ability to maintain calm under pressure, observe carefully, and intervene with precision became his defining strength. By consistently demonstrating competence and control, he not only survived these trials but emerged from them with his reputation enhanced, solidifying his place as a figure whose influence extended across multiple layers of the organization. Omar's ascent, therefore, was a study in quiet accumulation. Each act, each decision, each measured step contributed to a growing legend. It was not a rise marked by spectacle, but by consistent, deliberate mastery of his environment, relationships, and the rules of the underworld. Through patience, strategy, and the silent assertion of authority, he became a figure whose reputation commanded attention, instilled caution, and earned respect. By the end of this period, Omar had moved beyond the role of a mere enforcer. He had become a central figure within the organization, a strategist capable of influencing outcomes, a presence whose silence carried weight, and a man whose calculated actions shaped the environment around him. The early successes of his rise laid the groundwork for greater challenges and higher stakes, preparing him for the operations, rivalries, and legends that would define his later years. In every sense, El Silencio was no longer just a name, it was a symbol of disciplined power, quiet authority, and the subtle mastery of a world defined by shadows, loyalty, and risk. Omar's reputation as El Silencio had grown steadily, yet it was during his first major confrontation with a rival faction that the true measure of his influence would be tested. This was not a skirmish of words or casual threats, it was a calculated, tension-filled situation that demanded every ounce of his patience, observation, and strategic insight. The rival faction had begun encroaching on territory controlled by Omar's organization, challenging authority, and testing the loyalty of individuals under his watch. It was a delicate situation, where one wrong move could ignite violence, fracture alliances, or expose vulnerabilities to the wider underworld. From the outset, Omar approached the situation with his hallmark calm. He did not rush to meet the challenge with force, nor did he issue ultimatums or threats. Instead, he observed carefully, noting the behaviors, routines, and tendencies of those involved. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered communication was catalogued in his mind. He assessed the strengths and weaknesses of the opposing faction, the loyalties and doubts of his own allies, and the broader consequences of any potential escalation. By understanding the underlying dynamics, he positioned himself to act decisively at the precise moment that would maximize effect while minimizing unnecessary risk. The early stages of the confrontation were tense but quiet. Omar's presence alone altered the mood in rooms where meetings were held, in alleys where negotiations took place, and in offices where decisions were being made. Rivals became wary of his silence, uncertain if a threat lay behind it or if he was merely observing. Allies were reassured, knowing that his careful attention meant that interventions would be measured and reliable. This subtle psychological influence was a cornerstone of his approach, allowing him to shape the situation before any direct action was taken. Omar's first step was to gather intelligence discreetly. He assigned trusted allies to monitor movements, intercept communications, and report subtle shifts in behavior. Simultaneously, he moved among his own ranks, ensuring loyalty, reinforcing the rules of engagement, and identifying any potential fractures in commitment. The balance of power, he knew, relied not only on confrontation but also on the perception of control. By projecting confidence and precision through observation and preparation, he began to tilt the equilibrium in his favor without a single word being exchanged. When the moment of confrontation arrived, Omar acted with precision. He confronted the rival faction not with anger, not with volume, but with calculated authority. A gesture, a controlled movement, a measured positioning, each action communicated dominance and inevitability. The rivals, expecting bluster or spectacle, were caught off guard by his composed and deliberate approach. The tension in the room was palpable, yet the resolution was subtle, compliance was achieved, respect was reinforced, and escalation was avoided. This encounter solidified Omar's reputation not merely as an enforcer, but as a strategist whose silence and presence could shape outcomes more effectively than any outburst or display of force. The psychological dimension of the confrontation was as important as the physical or operational aspect. Omar understood that in conflict, perception often mattered as much as reality. By maintaining calm, he instilled uncertainty in his adversaries. They could not predict his next move, and this hesitation often led to self-restraint or miscalculation. Allies, conversely, were reassured by his control, gaining confidence in their own actions and trust in his guidance. Silence became a tool, a form of influence that extended beyond immediate outcomes, shaping the behaviors, expectations, and reactions of all involved. Following the confrontation, Omar focused on consolidating influence and ensuring long-term stability. He reinforced alliances, rewarded loyalty, and subtly reminded both friends and foes of the principles that governed the underworld. Every decision was calculated to maintain equilibrium, prevent retaliation, and reinforce the perception of authority. By acting decisively yet quietly, he ensured that the rival faction understood the consequences of defiance, while also maintaining a level of respect and restraint that prevented further escalation. The operation was not about spectacle, it was about establishing control and reinforcing his reputation as a man whose presence alone carried weight. The event also marked a turning point in how Omar was perceived within the wider organization. Senior figures, who had observed his methods, began to rely on him for increasingly complex assignments, recognizing that his combination of strategy, discretion, and precision was rare and invaluable. His ability to manage high-stakes situations without resorting to unnecessary violence or noise set him apart from peers, and his influence grew accordingly. He was no longer simply an enforcer or a silent observer, he had become a figure whose judgment shaped the actions and decisions of others across multiple layers of the hierarchy. Omar's approach during this confrontation further reinforced the principles that had guided him from the beginning: patience, observation, and disciplined action. He demonstrated that true power did not require theatrics or intimidation, but could be exerted through careful preparation, psychological insight, and the precise application of authority. The resolution of the conflict enhanced his legend, creating stories whispered among allies and rivals alike, stories of a man whose calm could dominate even the most volatile situations, and whose silence could unsettle the most aggressive adversaries. In the days following the confrontation, Omar's influence was evident in the behavior of both allies and rivals. Those who had witnessed his approach adjusted their own actions, aware that his presence could shape outcomes without any overt demonstration. He had established a precedent: challenges could be met, disputes resolved, and authority asserted without raising a voice or displaying force unnecessarily. This subtle mastery of control reinforced the respect and fear that had become synonymous with his name, further entrenching El Silencio as a figure of quiet power within the underworld. The confrontation also offered lessons for Omar himself. He understood the importance of timing, the necessity of accurate assessment, and the value of patience in high-pressure situations. Every nuance of the encounter, from body language to whispered exchanges, became part of his growing repository of knowledge about human behavior, strategy, and the subtle mechanics of influence. These insights would inform his actions in future operations, refining his methods and enhancing the effectiveness of his silent authority. By the conclusion of this first major confrontation, Omar had not only reinforced his personal reputation but also strengthened the organizational position he represented. He had demonstrated the effectiveness of silent authority, the power of careful observation, and the impact of precise action. Allies trusted him more, rivals feared him more, and the legend of El Silencio grew. The encounter became a defining moment, a quiet testament to his strategic mastery, patience, and unwavering command of situations, setting the stage for even greater challenges and higher stakes in the years to come. Following his first major confrontation with a rival faction, Omar found himself entering a phase of consolidation, a time when influence, authority, and reputation needed to be maintained with as much care as they had been earned. The underworld was never static, power shifted subtly, alliances could fracture unexpectedly, and loyalty was often tested by ambition or opportunity. Omar understood that achieving respect and fear was only part of the equation, sustaining it required continuous attention, precise action, and the steady reinforcement of his presence. This was a period that would further define El Silencio, not just as an enforcer, but as a master of subtle authority and strategic influence. The consolidation process began with a careful assessment of his allies. Omar knew that the strength of his position depended not only on his own abilities but on the reliability and loyalty of those around him. He spent time observing behavior, evaluating commitment, and identifying potential vulnerabilities within his inner circle. Every interaction, no matter how small, offered insight. By quietly monitoring responses to his decisions, measuring reactions in tense situations, and noting subtle shifts in tone or body language, he could predict potential fractures before they became problems. This attention to detail allowed him to act preemptively, strengthening loyalty and addressing subtle discontent before it escalated. Equally important was the management of rivals within the organization. Ambition, envy, and competition were constants in the mafia world, and those who sought to challenge his influence had to be carefully assessed and managed. Omar did not confront these figures with overt aggression or bluster. Instead, he relied on his signature combination of patience, observation, and calculated action. Subtle gestures, timely interventions, and strategic positioning allowed him to assert authority without unnecessary conflict. Rivals began to understand that his silence was a signal, not absence, that every measured action carried weight, and that challenging him without thought could invite consequences they were ill-prepared to handle. During this period, Omar also focused on reinforcing the rules and structures of the organization. Discipline and loyalty were essential for maintaining order, and he took it upon himself to ensure that these principles were consistently applied. He mediated disputes, clarified expectations, and reminded both allies and subordinates of the consequences of defiance. His interventions were calm, measured, and precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding. By doing so, he not only reinforced his own authority but strengthened the cohesion of the organization as a whole, ensuring that the machinery of control continued to operate efficiently under his watchful eye. One of the more subtle but critical aspects of consolidation involved perception management. Omar understood that influence was as much about what people believed as what actually occurred. By carefully controlling the visibility of his actions, emphasizing decisive moments, and allowing stories of his capability to circulate quietly, he shaped the perception of his power across the underworld. Allies gained confidence in his leadership, rivals developed caution, and the organization itself became more stable under his influence. In this way, Omar's reputation became self-reinforcing, a quiet but powerful force that extended beyond his immediate actions. Part of consolidating power also involved ensuring operational efficiency. Omar began to oversee a series of enforcement and negotiation tasks, each carefully selected to reinforce loyalty and demonstrate competence. He prioritized strategic thinking over brute force, subtlety over spectacle, and precision over volume. Each operation was executed with meticulous attention to detail, from assessing risks to anticipating reactions, to implementing contingencies. Successes were quietly noted, failures were analyzed, and lessons were incorporated into future planning. Over time, This approach not only solidified his reputation but also created an operational framework that others within the organization came to rely upon. Omar's methods of influence extended beyond enforcement and operational tasks. He cultivated relationships through trust, reliability, and subtle reinforcement of loyalty. Allies who observed his calm under pressure, his precision in action, and his unwavering attention developed a deep respect for his judgment. This trust allowed him to delegate responsibilities while maintaining control, ensuring that operations ran smoothly even in his absence. In this way, Omar's influence became multidimensional. He was not only a direct enforcer but a strategic figure whose authority extended through the actions of those he guided. Challenges during this period were inevitable. Ambitious figures within the organization occasionally tested boundaries, external rivals probed for weaknesses, and unforeseen circumstances threatened to destabilize his carefully maintained balance. Omar addressed each situation with the same approach that had guided him from the start: observation first, calculation second, and action only when necessary. He avoided unnecessary confrontation, but when intervention was required, it was decisive, precise, and strategically calculated. This consistency further reinforced his authority, making it clear that defiance or misjudgment would be met with silent but undeniable consequences. Another aspect of consolidation involved long-term planning. Omar understood that influence was not static, it required continuous cultivation. He analyzed potential threats, anticipated changes in the power structure, and prepared contingencies for various scenarios. By thinking several steps ahead, he ensured that his authority remained stable and adaptable. This strategic foresight allowed him to maintain control over the organization, influence the behavior of allies and rivals alike, and anticipate the shifts in the underworld that could otherwise destabilize his position. As his influence solidified, Omar began to exert a subtle but pervasive presence across the organization's operations. He monitored enforcement actions, oversaw negotiations, and ensured that rules were respected without the need for constant supervision. His network of trusted allies acted as extensions of his authority, carrying out tasks with the same precision and discretion that he demanded. In this way, Omar's consolidation of power was not about visibility or display, but about creating a structure in which his influence was embedded in the operations themselves, a quiet, resilient network that reinforced his reputation at every level. By the end of this period, Omar had achieved a level of stability and influence that few within the organization could rival. His combination of strategic foresight, patient observation, disciplined action, and subtle psychological mastery had transformed him from a capable enforcer into a central figure within the hierarchy. The lessons learned during this time, the importance of loyalty, perception, precision, and patience, would guide him in future challenges, allowing him to maintain control, navigate rivalries, and continue building the legend of El Silencio. In every interaction, whether negotiating, enforcing, or observing, Omar's silence remained his greatest tool. It allowed him to shape perception, control outcomes, and command respect without the need for words. Allies trusted him, rivals feared him, and the organization itself operated with greater stability under his quiet but powerful guidance. In the calm and measured mastery of this period, Omar solidified the foundation of his enduring influence, a foundation that would support him through the increasingly complex and dangerous operations that lay ahead. With his influence consolidated and his reputation firmly established, Omar entered a period marked by daring operations that would test not only his skill as an enforcer but also his strategic genius. These were not reckless acts of violence, nor were they displays of bravado. Each operation required meticulous planning, observation, and precise execution. Omar approached these challenges with the same calm, measured discipline that had defined his rise, understanding that success depended on patience, preparation, and the quiet mastery of human behavior. One of his earliest daring assignments involved intercepting a rival group attempting to infiltrate the organization's control over certain territories. This task was fraught with risk. Misjudgment could lead to violent retaliation, fractures within his own ranks, or exposure to authorities. Omar approached the mission with careful observation, studying patterns of movement, routines, and communication methods of the rival faction. He assigned trusted allies to gather intelligence discreetly while he monitored responses and anticipated every possible scenario. His approach was not about confrontation, but about positioning, ensuring that the outcome favored his organization without unnecessary chaos or public spectacle. When the moment of intervention arrived, Omar's strategy was precise and deliberate. He did not rush, he did not shout, and he did not display aggression for its own sake. Instead, he relied on subtle cues, a well-timed presence, controlled gestures, and the careful deployment of allies to guide the outcome. The rival faction, unprepared for such calm and methodical resistance, was forced to comply without a single unnecessary confrontation. In this way, Omar achieved the objective efficiently, maintaining both authority and the perception of control, and further cementing the legend of El Silencio. Another significant operation during this period involved enforcing loyalty among individuals whose allegiance had wavered. Such missions were delicate, requiring not just the application of authority but also the reinforcement of trust and fear in equal measure. Omar approached each situation as a psychological puzzle, observing the behaviors, motivations, and relationships of those involved. He allowed individuals to reveal themselves through subtle actions, using his silence as a means of assessing sincerity and gauging potential risk. When action was required, it was measured and decisive, ensuring that loyalty was reaffirmed without provoking unnecessary resentment or rebellion. The balance between respect and caution was critical, and Omar's mastery of these dynamics allowed him to succeed where others might have relied solely on intimidation. During this period, Omar also began to extend his influence beyond immediate operations, positioning himself as a strategist whose presence shaped broader organizational decisions. Senior figures increasingly sought his counsel, trusting his judgment in matters of negotiation, territory disputes, and the resolution of internal conflicts. His ability to anticipate reactions, understand human motivations, and act decisively when required made him an invaluable asset. Allies and subordinates came to rely on his insight, while rivals recognized that any misstep in his presence could have consequences far greater than they could predict. Omar's silence, once a personal trademark, had become a strategic instrument that influenced the decisions of others across multiple layers of the hierarchy. One particularly daring operation involved a high-stakes negotiation between rival factions over lucrative territory. The potential for violence was high, and the stakes extended beyond immediate gain, touching on long-term influence and organizational stability. Omar's role was to ensure compliance, enforce authority, and guide the negotiation toward a peaceful resolution. He approached the situation with meticulous preparation, understanding the ambitions, fears, and weaknesses of each party. When the negotiation began, he remained calm and silent, letting his presence communicate authority. Subtle gestures, strategic positioning, and carefully chosen words were enough to secure the desired outcome without a violent confrontation. The success of this operation not only reinforced his authority but also demonstrated his capacity to operate effectively in complex, high-pressure environments. These operations highlighted Omar's unique ability to combine observation, patience, and action. Unlike others who relied on brute force or public displays of dominance, he mastered the art of influence through subtlety. Every movement, every decision, and every intervention was carefully calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum disruption. Allies learned to anticipate his interventions, rivals learned to fear his presence, and the organization as a whole benefited from his disciplined approach. His silence, far from being a limitation, became a tool of strategic mastery, allowing him to operate effectively across diverse and challenging situations. Omar's daring operations also served to reinforce loyalty and morale within his own ranks. By executing missions with precision and minimal risk, he demonstrated competence and reliability, inspiring confidence among those who worked alongside him. He rewarded loyalty quietly but consistently, ensuring that those who followed his guidance felt both valued and protected. This careful balance of discipline, reward, and measured enforcement created a culture of trust and respect, further embedding his influence within the organization. Throughout these missions, Omar's understanding of human behavior became increasingly sophisticated. He observed subtle cues, interpreted intentions, and anticipated reactions with remarkable accuracy. This insight allowed him to guide outcomes without relying solely on force, using his presence and reputation as instruments of control. Even in situations where confrontation was unavoidable, his ability to assess risk and act decisively ensured that the objectives were achieved efficiently and effectively. Each successful operation added to his growing legend, reinforcing the perception that El Silencio was a force beyond ordinary comprehension, quiet, precise, and unstoppable. By the end of this period, Omar had not only proven his capability in daring operations but had also elevated his role within the organization to that of a strategic linchpin. His combination of calm authority, psychological insight, and operational precision allowed him to navigate the complexities of the underworld with unmatched skill. Allies trusted him implicitly, rivals feared his presence, and his reputation as a master strategist and enforcer became firmly entrenched. These early operations were more than mere tests of skill, they were formative experiences that refined Omar's methods, expanded his influence, and solidified the principles that would define him for the rest of his career. Patience, observation, precision, and the strategic use of silence had proven themselves not only effective but essential. Through these challenges, Omar El Silencio had begun to embody a rare combination of authority and subtlety, a figure whose presence alone could shape outcomes and whose calculated actions left a lasting impression on all who encountered him. In the calm aftermath of these daring operations, Omar continued to move quietly through the underworld, observing, guiding, and enforcing with measured discipline. Each success reinforced his influence, each silent gesture strengthened his reputation, and each calculated action further built the legend of a man who needed no words to command respect. Through skill, patience, and quiet mastery, Omar had solidified his place as a central figure in the organization, prepared to face the ever-increasing challenges and rivalries that would define the next chapter of his story. As Omar continued to navigate the shadows of the underworld, his influence began to extend beyond immediate operations and organizational control. A quiet notoriety was growing around him, not the loud, sensational kind that filled tabloids, but a subtle, pervasive recognition among those who understood the intricate web of power in the city's criminal underworld. People spoke of him in hushed tones, aware that El Silencio was more than a nickname, it was a symbol of precision, patience, and unspoken authority. His legend spread not through flamboyant displays or reckless actions but through the consistent, disciplined mastery of situations that others struggle to control. The nature of this notoriety was deeply psychological. Omar's silence, his calm observation, and his calculated interventions created an aura of inevitability. Those who crossed paths with him quickly realized that any engagement, whether negotiation, confrontation, or enforcement, would unfold according to his terms. The uncertainty created by his quiet presence unsettled rivals and reinforced the loyalty of allies. It was as if the environment itself shifted subtly in response to him, bending outcomes toward his design before a single word was spoken. This influence extended beyond personal interactions, shaping decisions, behavior, and even the movement of resources throughout the organization. Omar's growing legend was also nurtured through strategic discretion. He avoided unnecessary attention, ensuring that his actions were visible only to those who needed to observe them. Stories of his capabilities circulated quietly, shared among trusted circles, and slowly built a perception of authority that extended far beyond his immediate sphere. Unlike other figures in the underworld who relied on intimidation or spectacle, Omar allowed reputation to do much of the work. By demonstrating consistent competence and control, he created an enduring impression of power that was reinforced each time he acted with precision. Over time, this quiet notoriety became a self-sustaining force, a network of respect and caution that strengthened his influence without drawing the gaze of those outside the organization. One of the more subtle yet significant aspects of this period was the interplay between perception and reality. While Omar was undeniably effective in operations, it was the stories, carefully managed, quietly circulated, that amplified his legend. Allies spoke of situations resolved without a word, of rival factions deterred by his mere presence, and of interventions that seemed almost preordained. These narratives, though understated, shaped behavior, instilling caution among rivals and confidence among loyalists. Omar understood the power of these perceptions and allowed them to grow organically, reinforcing his position without the need for ostentation or force. As his notoriety expanded, Omar also became more mindful of the broader implications of his reputation. He recognized that influence in the underworld was fragile, perception could shift, loyalties could waver, and miscalculations could be costly. Each decision, each intervention, and each silent action had to be considered not only in terms of immediate effect but also in its long-term impact on his standing. By maintaining consistency in behavior, demonstrating competence, and reinforcing loyalty, Omar ensured that his growing legend remained stable, credible, and resilient against both internal and external challenges. During this period, he also began to interact with figures beyond his immediate organization, including allies, rivals, and intermediaries whose actions affected the broader balance of power in the city. Each encounter required careful assessment, the precise calibration of influence, and the subtle assertion of authority. Omar's silence, far from being a limitation, allowed him to gather intelligence, evaluate intentions, and respond in ways that were both effective and minimally exposed. He became adept at using his presence to guide decisions, shape negotiations, and influence outcomes without overt action, demonstrating a level of strategic mastery rare even among seasoned figures. The psychological impact of his growing notoriety extended to both allies and adversaries. Allies, inspired by his calm authority and strategic insight, became more disciplined, more loyal, and more attentive to their own conduct. Rivals, unsettled by the uncertainty surrounding his actions and the inevitability implied by his reputation, often hesitated or miscalculated, giving Omar and his organization a decisive advantage. This quiet psychological leverage became as valuable as any operational skill, allowing him to shape behavior and outcomes across multiple levels of interaction without drawing unnecessary attention to himself. Omar's legend also benefited from the consistency with which he approached enforcement and strategic operations. Each successful mission, each carefully managed negotiation, and each subtle intervention reinforced the perception of mastery. People began to recognize patterns. When Omar was present, outcomes were measured, precise, and largely under his control. This predictability, paradoxically, enhanced both fear and respect, as it demonstrated not only capability but also the certainty that his presence could alter the course of events. It was a silent authority, a mastery of environment and psychology that required no explanation, only observation. During this period, Omar became increasingly aware of the power of patience. Many rivals and observers underestimated the slow accumulation of influence, assuming that only bold or visible actions could command respect. Omar, however, understood that true power often grew quietly, solidified through repeated demonstration of competence, strategic foresight, and disciplined action. By allowing his reputation to develop naturally, he created a perception of inevitability. His influence would continue to expand, and those who misjudged it would discover the cost of underestimating him. Another significant factor in his growing notoriety was the careful cultivation of trust among allies. Omar rewarded loyalty, protected those who demonstrated reliability, and intervened when needed to prevent betrayal or misjudgment. By balancing enforcement with protection, he strengthened the bonds of trust and ensured that his influence was not only respected but embraced by those who depended on him. This subtle combination of fear, respect, and loyalty created a resilient network of support, allowing Omar to operate effectively even in high-stakes, unpredictable environments. By the end of this period, Omar's quiet notoriety had become a defining element of his identity. El Silencio was no longer simply a name, it was a symbol of strategic mastery, psychological insight, and disciplined authority. Allies, rivals, and observers alike understood that his presence carried weight, that his interventions were deliberate, and that his influence extended far beyond immediate interactions. The legend he cultivated quietly, deliberately, and without spectacle became a cornerstone of his enduring power, ensuring that even in the complex, dangerous world of the underworld, Omar's authority remained unchallenged and respected. Through careful observation, measured action, and strategic discretion, Omar had transformed reputation into a tool, perception into leverage, and presence into authority. Each interaction, each decision, and each silent intervention reinforced the idea that El Silencio was a force beyond ordinary comprehension, a man whose mastery of patience, precision, and psychology allowed him to shape the world around him quietly, efficiently, and decisively. The stage was now set for even greater challenges, higher stakes, and more daring operations that would define the next chapters of his story, continuing the legend of a man whose silence spoke louder than words ever could. As Omar's influence grew, so too did the scrutiny of law enforcement and rival observers. The underworld was never a world of complete invisibility, and his reputation as El Silencio inevitably drew attention from those seeking to curb the power of the organization. This period introduced a subtle but persistent tension, the constant awareness that every movement could be observed, every action interpreted, and any mistake could carry consequences far beyond the immediate environment. Yet Omar, true to his disciplined nature, approached these pressures with patience, calculation, and a quiet mastery that would come to define this stage of his career. Law enforcement's interest in Omar was less about his silence and more about the undeniable impact he had on the organization. He was efficient, strategic, and precise, traits that made him difficult to track or predict. Unlike other figures who drew attention through flamboyance or reckless actions, Omar's quiet approach left little trail. Surveillance teams, informants, and analysts struggled to piece together his movements or anticipate his interventions. To those tasked with monitoring the underworld, his reputation was a puzzle, a presence whose actions were felt but rarely seen, whose influence shaped outcomes that appeared almost preordained. During this period, Omar became increasingly adept at operating under the watchful eyes of law enforcement. Every meeting, every journey, and every operational decision was carefully considered to minimize exposure. He relied on trusted intermediaries to convey messages, used discreet methods to observe rival movements, and ensured that his presence remained strategic rather than conspicuous. By controlling the visibility of his actions, he could influence outcomes without attracting unnecessary attention, maintaining both operational effectiveness and personal security. The tension of evading capture and scrutiny added a psychological dimension to Omar's work. Unlike direct confrontations with rival factions, which relied on strategy and physical presence, this challenge required an almost invisible mastery of perception, movement, and timing. Every decision had to account for the possibility of surveillance, betrayal, or misinterpretation. Omar's silence and disciplined approach became invaluable tools. By revealing little and observing much, he remained several steps ahead of both law enforcement and adversaries. This careful balance of action and discretion reinforced his growing legend, as those who sought to monitor him realized the futility of predicting or controlling his movements. One particularly delicate situation involved a planned operation that intersected with areas under active investigation. Omar meticulously planned every detail, considering not only the operational objectives but also potential risks posed by surveillance and informants. Trusted allies were briefed with precision, contingencies were established for multiple scenarios, and movements were executed with controlled timing. The operation succeeded with minimal exposure, demonstrating Omar's ability to navigate high-risk environments while maintaining discretion and authority. To those within the organization, the success was another testament to his skill. To those observing from the outside, it reinforced the mystique of El Silencio, a figure capable of shaping outcomes without leaving traces. During this period, Omar also learned the subtle art of managing indirect threats from law enforcement, rival informants, and opportunistic individuals. He recognized that influence extended beyond direct confrontation and that control could be maintained through strategic communication, carefully managed alliances, and the selective dissemination of information. By guiding perceptions and shaping expectations, he created an environment in which risks were mitigated before they materialized. Allies remained confident, rivals were cautious, and law enforcement faced the persistent challenge of interpreting a man whose presence was felt more than it was seen. The psychological impact of these pressures on Omar was profound yet silent. Unlike others who might react with paranoia, aggression, or rash decisions, he approached the heightened scrutiny with calm deliberation. Observation became his constant tool, patience became his strategy, and every action, from simple movements to complex operations, was carefully considered for both immediate and long-term effect. This mental discipline reinforced his capacity to act decisively under pressure, ensuring that even in the most precarious situations, he retained control of both events and perception. Omar's encounters with law enforcement also had the effect of further elevating his legend within the underworld. Allies and rivals alike became increasingly aware of his ability to operate effectively in environments fraught with risk, maintaining influence and authority without drawing unwanted attention. The careful orchestration of actions under scrutiny, the avoidance of unnecessary exposure, and the success of high-stakes operations all contributed to the mythos surrounding El Silencio. His reputation became not only one of efficiency and authority but also of near-mythical invulnerability, a man whose mastery extended even to the unseen pressures of the outside world. Even in moments of heightened risk, Omar's methods remained consistent: observe first, calculate second, act decisively but quietly. He relied on intuition informed by years of experience, reading patterns, anticipating reactions, and positioning himself in ways that minimized vulnerability. Allies trusted this approach implicitly, knowing that his judgment balanced operational success with safety. Rivals hesitated, uncertain how to engage with a figure whose calm could diffuse or dominate situations without a single word. Law enforcement, frustrated by the lack of overt evidence, found themselves responding to outcomes that seemed orchestrated by an unseen hand. The combination of operational skill, strategic foresight, and disciplined evasion reinforced the dual nature of Omar's influence. He was both a direct enforcer within his organization and an almost ghostly presence to those seeking to limit his power. This duality enhanced the psychological effect of his reputation. He could shape outcomes both within and outside the organization, commanding respect and caution through the careful balance of action, observation, and perception. His silence, already legendary, became a powerful instrument in the dance of shadows between law enforcement and the underworld. By the end of this period, Omar had not only navigated increased scrutiny and external pressure but had transformed these challenges into a platform for further growth. His ability to operate under observation, maintain control, and achieve objectives without exposure reinforced both his personal authority and the enduring mystique of El Silencio. Allies felt secure under his guidance, rivals approached with caution, and law enforcement struggled to anticipate his movements. The legend, cultivated through patience, precision, and disciplined silence, continued to grow, setting the stage for even more complex operations, higher stakes, and further expansion of his influence in the chapters yet to come. As Omar moved deeper into the intricate machinery of the underworld, he began to encounter situations that tested the full scope of his strategic mastery. These were no longer simple operations or isolated confrontations, they were complex, multi-layered challenges that required careful orchestration of personnel, resources, and perception. Every mission demanded not only precision in execution but also subtlety in maintaining loyalty, managing rivals, and anticipating reactions from both within and outside the organization. It was a phase that would define his ability to operate at the highest level of influence while maintaining the calm and silence that had become his signature. One of the earliest of these complex operations involved the negotiation and control of a newly emerging faction that threatened to destabilize the balance of power in several key territories. The faction had begun to assert itself with aggression and ambition, challenging the existing order and testing the allegiance of several individuals within Omar's network. This scenario required delicate handling. Overt displays of force could provoke a violent escalation, while passivity could undermine authority and invite further challenges. Omar's approach, as always, was calculated and deliberate. He observed patterns of behavior, identified weak points in rival cohesion, and noted which individuals could be influenced or persuaded without direct confrontation. The operation was executed with meticulous attention to timing and positioning. Omar utilized his trusted allies as extensions of his influence, placing them strategically to monitor developments, report subtle shifts, and maintain an invisible presence that guided outcomes. His own movements were measured, deliberate, and minimally visible, ensuring that the operation proceeded according to plan without drawing unnecessary attention. By maintaining control of both the visible and unseen aspects of the situation, Omar was able to influence the rival faction's behavior indirectly, nudging events toward a peaceful resolution while reinforcing the perception of his authority. A critical component of this period was the management of loyalty. Omar understood that his influence was only as strong as the reliability of those around him, and complex operations often exposed fractures in commitment. He approached these challenges with careful psychological observation, noting hesitation, uncertainty, or subtle dissent. Rather than responding with immediate punishment, he allowed patterns to emerge, using silence and measured presence to gauge true intent. When action was required, it was precise and calculated, reinforcing loyalty without provoking resentment. The ability to balance firmness with strategic patience became a hallmark of his leadership, further distinguishing him from peers who relied primarily on intimidation. In addition to managing internal dynamics, Omar was required to anticipate and neutralize the strategies of external adversaries. Rival factions, aware of his influence, often tested boundaries, probing for weaknesses or attempting to manipulate events to their advantage. Omar's response was rarely direct confrontation. Instead, he relied on careful observation, strategic deployment of allies, and the subtle manipulation of perception. By controlling what others believed about his intentions, he could steer rival actions in ways that minimized risk and maximized advantage. This interplay of strategy, timing, and psychological insight demonstrated a level of mastery that few could match. One notable example of a high-stakes operation involved a coordinated effort to reclaim territory that had been partially overtaken by a coalition of rival groups. Omar's strategy was multifaceted. He relied on intelligence gathering, the careful positioning of trusted operatives, and subtle negotiation to prevent escalation. Each move was calculated to achieve compliance while avoiding unnecessary conflict, and every intervention was designed to reinforce the perception of inevitability associated with his presence. By combining precision, patience, and subtle psychological leverage, Omar was able to restore control over the territory without sparking open violence, solidifying both his authority and the loyalty of those under his command. The complexity of these operations also demanded a sophisticated understanding of human behavior. Omar observed body language, tone, and decision-making patterns, using these cues to anticipate outcomes and adjust tactics. His silence, far from being passive, became a tool for extracting information, managing uncertainty, and influencing decisions without verbal assertion. Allies and rivals alike learned to interpret subtle signals, recognizing that Omar's calm presence often communicated more than words ever could. In this way, he shaped outcomes with minimal overt action, reinforcing his reputation as a strategist whose mastery extended beyond the physical into the psychological realm. Another dimension of these complex operations was risk management. Each mission carried potential for exposure, internal dissent, or retaliation. Omar meticulously assessed each scenario, considering the probabilities of success, the potential consequences of failure, and the contingencies necessary to safeguard both himself and the organization. This level of foresight allowed him to navigate dangerous situations with confidence, ensuring that objectives were achieved while minimizing exposure to threat. The discipline required to execute such operations reinforced his growing legend, as stories circulated about his ability to resolve highly volatile situations with calm precision. Through these operations, Omar also strengthened the structural integrity of the organization. By demonstrating consistent competence, reinforcing loyalty, and managing both internal and external dynamics, he created an environment of stability and predictability. Allies knew that his guidance would ensure success, rivals understood the risks of challenge, and the organization as a whole operated more efficiently under his influence. The combination of operational effectiveness and psychological mastery allowed Omar to consolidate power while maintaining discretion, a balance that few others could achieve. The success of these complex operations further amplified Omar's legend. Stories of his precision, calm authority, an ability to navigate perilous situations spread quietly through the underworld. The perception of inevitability that had followed him in earlier phases of his career became more pronounced, shaping behavior, expectations, and strategic decisions across multiple factions. His silence, strategic patience, and meticulous planning had evolved into a defining feature of his leadership, creating a mythos that extended well beyond his immediate actions. By the end of this period, Omar had proven himself capable of orchestrating operations that demanded the full spectrum of his skills: observation, patience, psychological insight, strategic planning, and precise execution. He had demonstrated the ability to manage loyalty, control perception, and navigate high-stakes scenarios without resorting to spectacle or rashness. The legend of El Silencio was now firmly established, built not only on his earlier successes but also on the mastery of complex, multi-layered operations that few could comprehend, let alone replicate. In these moments, Omar's influence transcended mere enforcement. He became a strategist, a silent orchestrator of events, and a figure whose presence could shape outcomes long before any direct action was taken. Allies, rivals, and observers all recognized the weight of his authority, the precision of his strategy, and the inevitability of his interventions. This period of complex operations marked a crucial stage in his evolution, solidifying the foundation for future challenges, rivalries, and legendary exploits that would continue to define the enduring myth of El Silencio. At the height of his career, Omar El Silencio had achieved a level of influence and authority that few in the underworld could rival. His reputation had grown to near mythical proportions, whispered in alleys, offices, and hidden corners of the city where organized power quietly moved. By now, his presence alone could shape the actions of allies and rivals alike, guiding decisions, enforcing loyalty, and deterring conflict without a single word being spoken. This was the apex of his silent mastery, a period in which every action, every observation, and every strategic move carried profound consequences for the balance of power in the criminal landscape. At this peak, Omar's approach to leadership was marked by an extraordinary combination of discipline and intuition. He had long ago recognized that overt displays of force, though sometimes necessary, were not the hallmark of true authority. Instead, he relied on careful observation, subtle positioning, and psychological insight to influence behavior and outcomes. Each decision was measured, every intervention precise, and the accumulation of these calculated actions had created a web of influence that extended through multiple layers of the organization. Allies respected his judgment, rivals feared the consequences of miscalculation, and the organization itself operated with a level of cohesion that reflected his guiding hand. One of the defining features of this period was the delicate balance Omar maintained between enforcement and diplomacy. Rival factions, aware of his growing influence, often attempted to challenge boundaries or test allegiances. Omar met these challenges not with rash aggression but with careful assessment. He observed the ambitions, vulnerabilities, and tendencies of those involved, then subtly guided their actions toward outcomes that reinforced his authority. Often, this involved minimal direct intervention, strategically placed intermediaries, timed actions, or controlled signals that conveyed his presence without exposure. The result was a complex orchestration in which his influence shaped events almost invisibly, yet unmistakably. The psychological tension of this period was significant. Omar operated in a world where perception was as critical as reality, where loyalty could be fragile, and where missteps could carry immediate consequences. Every decision had to account not only for immediate objectives but also for long-term stability, the cohesion of allies, and the reactions of rivals. The mental discipline required to navigate these pressures was immense, yet Omar handled it with the calm precision that had become his trademark. His silence, once merely a personal characteristic, had evolved into a strategic tool, allowing him to observe, assess, and act without revealing vulnerabilities or intentions. During this apex phase, Omar also began to engage with multiple factions simultaneously, managing operations, alliances, and conflicts across a broader landscape than ever before. This required a level of coordination and foresight that few could achieve. He relied on trusted lieutenants, but his oversight was meticulous. Each assignment was carefully structured to achieve maximum impact with minimal exposure. Communication was precise, indirect, and often nonverbal, reflecting his mastery of influence without spectacle. The result was a period in which the organization functioned almost seamlessly, with Omar's influence present in every decision and every outcome. A particularly notable element of his peak influence was the reinforcement of his personal legend. Stories of his strategic genius, silent interventions, and calm authority spread quietly through the underworld. Allies shared accounts of situations resolved without conflict, of rival factions deterred by his mere presence, and of operations executed with an almost preordained precision. These narratives reinforced the perception that El Silencio was a figure beyond ordinary understanding, someone whose authority and influence extended beyond immediate observation, shaping both behavior and outcomes in subtle but powerful ways. Omar's interactions during this period also reflected a keen understanding of human psychology. He could read hesitation, interpret subtle gestures, and anticipate actions before they occurred. This insight allowed him to manage risk, enforce loyalty, and guide decisions with a minimal footprint. Allies learned to trust his judgment implicitly, rivals hesitated, and intermediaries carefully navigated the intricate web of influence he had woven. His silence became a language of its own, communicating authority, expectation, and consequence without the need for speech. Despite his dominance, Omar remained acutely aware of the fragility of power. The higher he rose, the more vigilant he needed to be against internal dissent, betrayal, and external threats. He continued to operate with patience, foresight, and subtlety, ensuring that every intervention reinforced stability rather than exposing vulnerability. His peak influence was thus characterized not only by authority but also by the careful management of risk, perception, and loyalty, a delicate balance that required constant attention and disciplined judgment. This period also marked the refinement of Omar's strategic approach to operations. High-stakes missions, complex negotiations, and potential confrontations were meticulously planned, executed with precision, and monitored for both immediate and long-term impact. By coordinating these activities quietly and efficiently, he maintained control over multiple facets of the organization and influenced the broader criminal landscape without drawing undue attention. Each success, achieved without overt display, reinforced his legend and the sense of inevitability that seemed to accompany his presence. Omar's ability to maintain authority during this apex phase relied heavily on the dual power of respect and fear. Allies were motivated by loyalty and confidence in his judgment, rivals were deterred by the uncertainty and inevitability that his presence implied. This duality created an environment in which influence was exercised efficiently and effectively, minimizing unnecessary conflict while maximizing strategic outcomes. Omar had mastered the art of shaping behavior not through loud assertion but through subtle guidance, anticipation, and the perception of power that extended beyond immediate observation. By the end of this peak phase, Omar had solidified his role as a central figure in the underworld, a strategist and enforcer whose authority and influence were unmatched. His mastery of observation, patience, psychological insight, and precise action had allowed him to operate at the highest levels of power, shaping outcomes, reinforcing loyalty, and managing risk with extraordinary skill. The legend of El Silencio was now firmly entrenched, a symbol of calm authority, strategic mastery, and silent dominance that inspired respect, caution, and even awe among allies, rivals, and observers alike. This period of peak influence represented both the culmination of Omar's rise and the foundation for the challenges to come. While his power was formidable, it was also delicate, reliant on the disciplined application of skill, the careful management of perception, and the ongoing observation of human behavior. In this apex of authority, Omar demonstrated that true power was not loud or brash, but quiet, precise, and enduring, a mastery of influence that required patience, foresight, and unwavering control. The story of El Silencio at this height would become a benchmark of strategic genius in the criminal underworld, a period in which the silence of a single man could shape the fate of many, and in which the calm mastery of one figure ensured that his legend would echo long into the shadows of history. Even at the height of his power, Omar el Silencio understood that the underworld was never static. The very forces that had allowed him to rise, loyalty, respect, strategic mastery, could also give rise to the first subtle cracks in his authority. Internal tensions, rival ambitions, and the unpredictable consequences of accumulated power began to surface, reminding Omar that dominance required constant vigilance. These emerging challenges were not loud or immediate, they manifested quietly, in hesitation, in whispered conversations, and in subtle shifts of allegiance. Yet to Omar, every signal mattered, every nuance of behavior was a potential indicator of the balance of power shifting beneath the surface. The first signs of internal tension came from ambitious lieutenants who had grown accustomed to his leadership but now tested boundaries, emboldened by his extended absence during operations or his quiet confidence in overseeing multiple facets of the organization. Some questioned decisions in subtle ways, others began to act independently, seeking to expand influence without explicit approval. Omar recognized that these moments of hesitation or subtle defiance were natural in a hierarchical structure, particularly in a world built on ambition and influence. However, he also understood that leaving these fissures unchecked could eventually lead to open defiance or betrayal. To address these early signs of internal tension, Omar relied on observation and psychological insight rather than immediate punishment. He allowed patterns of behavior to emerge, observing body language, tone, and interactions with peers. His silence, as always, was a tool. It allowed others to reveal themselves, to expose intentions, and to inadvertently demonstrate where loyalties truly lay. When he did act, his interventions were precise and measured. A conversation here, a subtle correction there, or a discreet demonstration of authority served to reinforce boundaries without provoking open conflict. By managing internal tensions in this way, Omar preserved loyalty while discouraging ambition that might destabilize his control. Simultaneously, external pressures began to shift. Rival factions, once cautious in the face of his reputation, grew bolder as they observed moments of subtle internal discord. They tested territories, probed the limits of influence, and sought to exploit weaknesses wherever possible. Omar, however, remained a step ahead. His ability to anticipate rival maneuvers, combined with his deep understanding of human behavior, allowed him to address threats quietly and efficiently. By using his network of trusted allies and deploying subtle interventions, he neutralized challenges before they could escalate, maintaining control while avoiding unnecessary conflict. One particularly delicate situation involved a coalition of rivals attempting to undermine his authority through indirect influence. They sought to sway lieutenants, disrupt operations, and create the perception that Omar's control was weakening. Recognizing the potential consequences, Omar approached the situation with calm deliberation. He monitored communications, observed interactions, and subtly guided allies toward cohesion. By reinforcing loyalty and strategically demonstrating competence, he was able to prevent the coalition from gaining traction, all without engaging in overt confrontation. The episode underscored his mastery of influence, patience, and psychological acumen, a reminder that true power often operates in the invisible spaces between action and perception. Another layer of complexity arose from the shifting dynamics of trust. Even those who had proven themselves loyal were subject to subtle doubts and insecurities. Omar recognized that his prolonged absence or the delegation of authority could unintentionally create opportunities for misjudgment or misalignment. He addressed these dynamics with measured communication, symbolic demonstrations of presence, and targeted interventions that reinforced trust while discouraging deviation. The balance was delicate. Too much interference could erode confidence, too little could allow ambition to grow unchecked. Yet Omar navigated these challenges with the same quiet precision that had guided him from the earliest stages of his rise. This period also demanded an increasing awareness of the psychological burden of power. As the organization grew, as rivalries intensified, and as loyalties fluctuated, Omar carried the weight of anticipation and strategic foresight. Every decision had immediate consequences for operations, reputation, and cohesion, and every misstep could have cascading effects. He approached this responsibility with disciplined reflection, ensuring that his interventions were deliberate, timely, and effective. The quiet mastery of these pressures became a defining feature of his leadership, reinforcing both respect and trust among allies while maintaining caution and uncertainty among rivals. Amid these growing internal and external pressures, Omar also began to witness subtle cracks in the broader structure of the organization. Operations that had once run seamlessly occasionally encountered friction, minor conflicts emerged where previously there had been unity, and the perception of his inevitable control was subtly challenged. Each of these moments, though small in isolation, represented potential risks that could accumulate over time. Omar responded by reinforcing core principles: loyalty, discipline, and careful observation. He emphasized cohesion through quiet interventions, strategic guidance, and targeted demonstrations of competence, ensuring that small fissures did not evolve into open fractures. This period revealed a fundamental truth about power: even the most disciplined, strategic, and respected figures are vulnerable to the slow, incremental pressures of ambition, perception, and human unpredictability. Omar's ability to recognize these pressures, to anticipate their consequences, and to act with measured precision was what allowed him to navigate this phase without losing control. His silence, patience, and strategic foresight were not merely habits, they were essential tools for maintaining authority, managing tension, and preserving the structure he had built. By the end of this period, the stage was set for the next phase of Omar's story. Internal tensions had been contained but not eliminated, rival factions had been tested but remained vigilant, and the organization had retained cohesion through careful management and disciplined oversight. Yet the subtle cracks that had begun to appear hinted at the challenges to come, the inevitable tests of loyalty, strategy, and control that would define the later chapters of his career. Omar's mastery had carried him to the peak of influence, but the quiet pressures of human ambition and external threats served as a reminder that even a legend like El Silencio must continue to adapt, observe, and act with precision to maintain authority in a world where nothing remains static for long. Through this phase, Omar demonstrated that true power is not only measured by achievement or reputation but by the ability to sustain influence, navigate subtle threats, and maintain stability amidst constant change. It was a period of quiet tension, psychological insight, and strategic adaptation, a crucible in which the strength of his silence and the depth of his mastery were tested in ways that would prepare him for the more visible and dramatic challenges yet to come. In this delicate balance, Omar continued to shape his legend, proving that even the most silent of figures can command the course of events when mastery, patience, and foresight are combined. Even the most disciplined and strategic figures are not immune to betrayal, and for Omar, El Silencio, the first major cracks in the loyalty of his inner circle marked the beginning of a subtle but profound shift in his world. These betrayals were not dramatic or explosive at first, they emerged quietly, in whispered conversations, misdirected communications, and actions that seemed inconsequential in isolation but revealed deeper currents of disloyalty when viewed in context. Omar had long understood human nature, the interplay of ambition, fear, and self-interest, but even he had to adjust to the unsettling reality that those he trusted implicitly could act against him, whether out of fear, jealousy, or opportunity. The initial signs of betrayal were almost imperceptible. A lieutenant delayed the execution of a directive, a trusted intermediary misrepresented information, and subtle disagreements began to surface in strategic discussions. Omar, however, did not react impulsively. He observed, studied, and waited, letting the actions of others reveal their true intentions. His silence, which had long been a tool of authority, became a lens through which he could discern motives and anticipate moves. Every hesitation, every misstep, every minor deviation from expected behavior was a piece of a larger puzzle, and Omar's patience allowed him to see the whole picture before taking action. As the pattern of betrayal became clearer, the psychological tension within the organization increased. Omar had to navigate the delicate balance between maintaining control, punishing disloyalty, and preventing panic or further fractures. He approached the situation with the same precision that had characterized his operations for years. Interventions were measured and discreet, designed to restore order without exposing vulnerabilities or provoking open conflict. Even those who were implicated in betrayal were given opportunities to realign their loyalties, but it was clear that failure to do so would carry consequences both immediate and long-lasting. The complexity of this phase was heightened by the interplay of external pressures. Rival factions, sensing fissures within Omar's organization, attempted to exploit them, subtly testing boundaries, probing allegiances, and seeking advantage in moments of uncertainty. Omar anticipated these maneuvers, positioning allies strategically and observing rivals' actions without revealing his hand. By maintaining an almost invisible presence, he was able to neutralize threats before they escalated, ensuring that control remained in his hands. His silence, patience, and strategic foresight allowed him to manage both internal betrayal and external challenge simultaneously, a feat that few could achieve with equal calm and effectiveness. One particularly delicate scenario involved the betrayal of a lieutenant whose ambition had grown unchecked. This individual had sought to manipulate other members of the organization, subtly undermining Omar's directives and testing the boundaries of authority. Rather than responding with overt confrontation, Omar first gathered evidence, monitored interactions, and ensured that loyal allies were aligned. Only when the timing was precise did he intervene, addressing the betrayal with calculated authority that reinforced boundaries, restored loyalty, and sent a clear message to others without generating unnecessary chaos. The episode demonstrated Omar's ability to turn potential disruption into a lesson in loyalty and discipline, reinforcing the perception of inevitability that had long surrounded him. The psychological impact of these betrayals extended beyond the individuals involved. Allies became more aware of the fragility of trust, rivals recognized the precision of Omar's oversight, and the organization as a whole adjusted its behavior to accommodate both loyalty and caution. Omar's interventions were not only operationally effective but also subtly educational. They reinforced the principles of discipline, respect, and strategic awareness, reminding all that authority was maintained not by intimidation alone but through careful observation, timing, and decisive action. During this period, Omar also refined his methods of managing risk and uncertainty. He recognized that betrayal was rarely a singular event, it was often symptomatic of deeper discontent, shifting ambitions, or vulnerabilities within the network. By identifying patterns early, monitoring potential points of weakness, and acting with discretion, he was able to prevent minor fissures from evolving into larger crises. This approach required extraordinary patience, an understanding of human psychology, and the ability to anticipate reactions across multiple levels of interaction. His silence, once a personal trait, became a strategic instrument in this ongoing exercise of influence and control. Even as he addressed betrayals, Omar remained mindful of the perception of his authority. Actions had to be precise, interventions measured, and outcomes controlled to avoid creating the impression of vulnerability. By managing the response to disloyalty carefully, he maintained the aura of inevitability and competence that had long defined him. Allies observed his calm decisiveness, rivals recognized the futility of testing boundaries, and the organization as a whole adapted to a renewed understanding of the discipline and precision that underpinned Omar's authority. The cumulative effect of these betrayals and the careful handling of their consequences had a profound impact on Omar's leadership style. While his strategic mastery remained intact, there was now an added layer of vigilance, reflection, and subtle enforcement. The experience reinforced the importance of observation, patience, and psychological insight, reminding Omar that even the most loyal network is subject to the unpredictable impulses of human ambition and fear. Each intervention, each correction, each reinforcement of authority strengthened both control and perception, ensuring that the legend of El Silencio remained unchallenged even as challenges arose. By the end of this period, the organization had emerged stronger, more disciplined, and more attentive to the subtle dynamics of loyalty and power. Betrayals had been addressed, threats had been neutralized, and the hierarchy of influence was reaffirmed. Omar, through careful observation, decisive action, and the disciplined use of silence, had demonstrated once again that true power is measured not only by the ability to achieve objectives but by the capacity to sustain control, manage human complexity, and transform potential crises into opportunities for reinforcement. This phase of betrayal and response marked a turning point in Omar's story. It revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in even the most disciplined network, the delicate balance between authority and loyalty, and the quiet strength required to maintain both. Yet it also reinforced the enduring truth of Omar's legend, that mastery, patience, and strategic foresight can navigate the most treacherous currents of human behavior, and that even in the face of betrayal, a calm, observant, and disciplined figure can restore order, preserve authority, and ensure the continuity of influence. In the stillness that followed these interventions, Omar's reputation as El Silencio was reaffirmed. Allies respected his discernment, rivals approached with caution, and the organization as a whole recognized the precision and inevitability of his influence. The first major betrayals had tested the limits of loyalty and resilience, and through careful navigation, Omar had emerged with authority intact, lessons learned, and a legend strengthened by the quiet triumph over human unpredictability and ambition. The betrayals Omar, El Silencio, faced were not merely challenges to his authority, they were catalysts, forcing him to refine his strategies and assert control with even greater precision. What might have destabilized a less disciplined leader became, for Omar, an opportunity to demonstrate mastery over both human behavior and the unpredictable currents of the underworld. This period marked a transition from quiet observation to calculated action, a time in which he orchestrated responses with subtlety, ensuring that loyalty was restored, rivals were deterred, and his influence grew even stronger. Omar's approach to retaliation was unlike the dramatic, impulsive responses often portrayed in stories of gangland justice. There were no reckless confrontations, no brash displays of violence. Instead, his methods were measured, indirect, and carefully planned to achieve maximum effect with minimal exposure. He understood that perception was as important as action, that timing could amplify impact, and that the quiet assertion of control could reinforce authority more effectively than overt aggression. Each step he took was calculated to maintain the delicate balance of fear, respect, and loyalty that had long defined his leadership. One of the earliest maneuvers in this period involved a rival faction that had attempted to exploit internal fractures within his organization. They sought to sow dissent, manipulate allegiances, and undermine confidence in Omar's control. Rather than confronting them head-on, Omar orchestrated a series of subtle interventions. Trusted operatives were positioned strategically, communications were subtly redirected, and carefully placed signals conveyed the presence of authority without revealing the full extent of his plan. The rival faction, sensing a force beyond their understanding, hesitated and ultimately withdrew from the attempted manipulation. This indirect form of retaliation reinforced Omar's reputation for inevitability, the sense that his influence was inescapable and his interventions always precise. During this time, Omar also relied heavily on intelligence and observation. Every action, every hesitation, and every interaction within his network and among rivals was carefully monitored. He mapped alliances, tracked ambitions, and identified vulnerabilities. This meticulous understanding of the human and operational terrain allowed him to craft interventions that were highly effective without requiring overt force. By acting strategically and indirectly, Omar ensured that those who challenged him learned the consequences of misjudgment, while allies gained renewed confidence in his guidance and protection. An essential aspect of this period was the reinforcement of internal discipline. Betrayals had revealed not only the ambitions of certain individuals but also the need for renewed cohesion and clarity of loyalty within the organization. Omar implemented subtle mechanisms to test and reinforce allegiance, ranging from the distribution of responsibility to the quiet observation of decision-making patterns. These measures served a dual purpose: they discouraged future disloyalty and provided him with real-time insight into the stability of his network. By embedding loyalty checks into daily operations, Omar ensured that internal fractures were addressed before they could escalate, strengthening both his authority and the resilience of the organization. The escalation of rivalry also demanded a careful calibration of timing and response. External adversaries, emboldened by perceived moments of vulnerability, sought to exploit the slightest advantage. Omar, however, understood that immediate action was not always optimal. Patience and observation often created opportunities for more decisive and lasting outcomes. By allowing rival actions to unfold while maintaining strategic control, he could intervene at the precise moment when consequences would be most instructive, reinforcing both deterrence and respect. Each measured intervention was a lesson to rivals and allies alike. Omar's authority was patient, precise, and inevitable. One of the most intricate operations during this period involved a coordinated effort to neutralize multiple threats simultaneously, both internal and external. Omar relied on a network of trusted lieutenants to execute various elements of the plan, each carefully timed and strategically positioned. Communication was subtle, almost invisible, with directives conveyed indirectly to ensure discretion. The operation unfolded like a carefully choreographed sequence, with each participant understanding their role within the larger design. By the conclusion, the immediate threats were neutralized, loyalty was reinforced, and Omar's influence was elevated, not through violence, but through precise, controlled orchestration. Psychological insight continued to play a central role in Omar's strategic retaliation. He understood that fear, respect, and perception were as powerful as any operational tool. Allies who witnessed his interventions felt reassured by his mastery and careful judgment, while rivals recognized the futility of challenge. Each action was calibrated to shape behavior subtly, guiding decisions and reinforcing boundaries without exposing vulnerabilities. Omar's silence remained a potent instrument. It allowed him to observe, assess, and influence, while the uncertainty it created magnified the impact of every intervention. During this phase, Omar's reputation as El Silencio reached a new zenith. Stories circulated quietly, carried in whispers through the underworld, describing operations executed with uncanny precision, rivals deterred without confrontation, and loyalty restored through subtle mastery. These narratives reinforced the perception of inevitability that had long surrounded him, and they amplified both fear and respect among those who interacted with or observed him. His legend was no longer merely about quiet authority, it had become a symbol of calculated inevitability, a force that shaped outcomes with subtlety and precision. By the end of this period, the stage was set for the most ambitious and daring operations yet. Omar had transformed potential crises into opportunities, neutralized rival threats with surgical precision, and reinforced the loyalty and cohesion of his network. The combination of patience, observation, and indirect action had allowed him to maintain control even in moments of tension, ensuring that his influence remained unchallenged. Every intervention, every measured move, and every quiet demonstration of mastery reinforced the enduring truth: El Silencio commanded not only respect and fear but the inevitability of his influence. This phase of strategic retaliation, subtle orchestration, and calculated escalation solidified Omar's position as a central figure in the criminal landscape. It demonstrated that true mastery of the underworld was not achieved through force alone, but through patience, insight, and the ability to transform challenges into lessons for both allies and rivals. The legend of Omar El Silencio was now at its most potent, an enduring symbol of quiet authority, psychological acumen, and the precise orchestration of power that few could comprehend or confront. Even the most disciplined leaders faced the quiet pressures of time, ambition, and shifting alliances. For Omar El Silencio, the weight of sustaining dominance began to show in subtle ways. Loyal lieutenants tested boundaries, minor conflicts arose, and external rivals sensed openings where previously there were none. The underworld, once predictable under his control, now demanded constant vigilance. Small fissures appeared in the organization, a delayed order here, a hesitant ally there. Omar responded with the same patience and precision that had defined his rise, observing every action, anticipating intentions, and subtly guiding outcomes. He neutralized potential fractures through discreet interventions, reinforcing loyalty without exposing vulnerabilities. Even rival factions, probing for weakness, learned that his authority, though quietly exercised, remained formidable. The cumulative effect of these pressures marked the beginning of a subtle decline. Control was no longer effortless, maintaining influence required continuous attention and careful management of perception, trust, and alliances. Yet Omar's mastery, discipline, and psychological insight allowed him to navigate these challenges, demonstrating that true authority lies not only in power achieved but in power sustained. The legend of El Silencio persisted, tempered now by the quiet reality that even the strongest figures are subject to the inexorable tests of time, ambition, and change. Omar El Silencio's final chapter is quiet reflection and enduring legacy. After decades of calculated influence, his silence became a symbol of lasting authority. The networks he built remained loyal, his rivals cautious, and his legend whispered throughout the underworld. He showed that true mastery lies not in force, but in patience, observation, and subtle orchestration. Even as time passed, his story endured, teaching that influence can shape behavior and perception without words. El Silencio remains a testament to strategic brilliance, calm authority, and the enduring power of silence, a legend that lingers long after the shadows.